Welcome back. Now, Uber sees India as an important market with an enormous opportunity for further penetration. Speaking exclusively to me, the company's senior vice president and chief legal officer, Tony West, said that they are the largest employer in the country after the Indian Army and Indian Railways and have unlocked 44,600 crore rupees of economic value. West added that Uber is open to providing social security benefits to drivers in India, but cautions that it should not be hard-coded into the law. Here's a slice of that conversation.
I would say the biggest competition is seizing the opportunity. When you think about the India market for us, which is an incredibly important market, we're already in over 120 cities. We have over 3 million driver partners on the platform. We've been able to serve and had the privilege to serve over 100 million riders since 2013. It's an enormous market opportunity, and yet only about 0.5% of the country has been penetrated. It's really, when you think about the enormity of the opportunity yet to come, how we are able to do that, how we're able to make sure that there are great product market fits in this market, how we're able to ensure that we continue to innovate, that I think is our greatest competition.
That's interesting to hear. But before we dive into what the Indian market and how it's done for you and what your plans are for the future, let me ask you about a couple of broader global questions. I think I'm talking about the R word. Everyone's talking about it, 2023, hard landing, soft landing. We're discussing what kind of impact the recession is likely to have. We're looking at high inflation. The cheap money is out of the window. We're talking about high interest rates, rising fuel costs. That's a big concern.
That's right. It's a big concern. Absolutely.
Can you give us a picture of how you're gearing up for it, or what the estimated impact is likely to be for you, for Uber?
Well, I'll tell you, the business remains quite strong, and we're fortunate. Globally, the business remains strong. When you look at the United States, when you look at Europe, we're certainly trying to make sure we're well suited to go through any difficulty we might see on the economic front, on the macro front. It's interesting, of course, notwithstanding some of the clear macro hurdles you discussed, when you look at the Indian economy, in the global context, you're talking about 6% GDP. I mean, that's pretty much as robust as it gets these days. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that here you've got a growing economy with great opportunity, you've got great digital growth, you've got a great workforce here, young people who want to be engaged in writing the next chapter of the Indian success story, and we want to be a part of that.
But are you experiencing or likely to experience perhaps any short-term headwinds in terms of your business growth, given that these are concerns which are now pinching the pocket with people now managing their plans and their finances accordingly?
Well, again, we haven't seen that yet, but we are being very prudent and very careful. You may have heard that our own CEO, when asked about layoffs, has taken that off the table at this point and has said, as long as we continue to execute in the marketplace, as long as we're continuing to make sure we're being very prudent about the way we allocate our capital, and as long as we remain focused on EBITDA progression, on profitability, on free cash flow positivity, and we continue to see the results that we're seeing, then I think we're going to be well suited to withstand any kind of macro environment that we may encounter.
I think in part you've preempted my next question, but I'll ask you.
Well, that's good. I like that.
I'm referring to the subject of layoffs. That's been one common theme across a lot of big tech players. We've seen the likes of Meta, Twitter, Amazon. They're looking to rationalize their costs in gearing up for what they feel might be a cold winter. Just your sense as to what gives you that confidence that we haven't seen any layoffs yet, but are we likely to experience them in the future? And if not, at least a hiring cap or a hiring freeze, maybe? Is that something that's likely?
Well, so, one of the things that happened during the pandemic is, a lot of companies hired up during the pandemic. We actually did the opposite. We went through a very painful period where we had some significant layoffs around the world at Uber. We didn't know it at the time, but that actually positioned us well to withstand this current period in a way that says we don't need to look at layoffs at this time. Now, that doesn't mean we're not being very focused on our cost structure, on bringing down costs. We're always looking for ways to be more efficient in the way that we're able to bring the service of the platform to earners and to users. And we continue to be very, very disciplined on costs.
Speaking of costs, let's talk about the Indian market.
Yeah.
Very recently, we had the APAC head for Uber say that India is a high-growth, profitable market, soon to turn profitable. Can you give us some guidance as to how the Indian market is stacking up for you and what this profitability picture looks like going forward?
Well, it's definitely one that is on that trajectory to be a very profitable market, and that's going to be sustainable growth, sustainable profitability into the future. And that's one of the things that we're really excited about. Part of that comes from just the enormous scale of the business, right? I mean, we are the leading source or the largest source of livelihood creation behind the Indian Army and the Indian Railways. You know, that, of course, is a great opportunity. It's also a great privilege and a great responsibility, something we take very, very seriously. And so when you look at how do we deploy in a market as incredibly rich and diverse as India's, it means that we have to invest in multimodal. It means that we have to give people a whole different set of arrays of ways to get from point A to point B. It means that we need to collaborate with governments and state governments on their objectives. And so, you know, for instance, a great example is the partnership that we have with the Chennai Metro Rail Service to help ensure that we're providing that last mile connectivity in a way that helps to provide accessible, economic, affordable transportation from point A to point B, whether you're using an Uber product or not. And so when you look at, you know, the opportunity, whether it's on 2, 3, 4 or more wheels, whether that is bus service like we've launched in Gurgaon, whether that is auto rickshaw, which you have all over the country, whether that's moto or bike, we're looking for many, many different ways to take advantage of both the opportunity, but to also bring that accessibility of movement to India at large.
It's interesting you mentioned that collaborative spirit working with state governments as well as central governments, which is in fact one of the questions that I had in mind, that there was this one recent case in the Bombay High Court. It's traveled up to the Indian Supreme Court. The question essentially boiled down to, will Uber be compliant with the local regulations of the state or the central guidelines? Is there a need, is there a concern as far as Uber is concerned in terms of perhaps there being multiple regulations? Is there a need for some kind of uniform platform, uniform regulatory framework that will govern services so that one doesn't have to take upon oneself the compliance burden of multiple states?
Right. Well, that's where I think the communication is so important. I mean, Uber's quite used to working in an environment where there are sometimes conflicting regulations at different levels of government. The United States is a perfect example of this, where we have, you know, regulations at the federal, state, and the local level, and we have to oftentimes work with regulators to make sure we're harmonizing compliance in a way, again, that meets their objectives, but also facilitates innovation and the ability of individuals to get on the platform, to earn, to use that platform, and to use it in a magical way to, you know, sort of preserve that magical experience that we're all now very used to when it comes to using Uber. You know, and I think that's certainly going to be true here, and I think there's opportunity to do that. I mean, you know, if you look at something like the Code of Social Security, which the government has put out. I mean, I think that India is actually on the leading edge when it comes to recognizing that there is a category of gig worker that's just different than what we've seen traditionally between, you know, sort of either you're an employee or you're completely independent. That this category of worker not only deserves to have the flexibility that they choose, but that they are entitled to social benefits and protections that they deserve. And we wholeheartedly agree with that. We endorse that. We support that. Look forward to the implementation of that. But also want to say to the rest of the world that India is getting it right when they recognize that there needs to be a new framework that covers the way that people are increasingly now choosing to work.
You're making my job a lot easier because you're preempting the questions. This, in fact, was the next question that I had in my mind in terms of recognition for gig workers. Now, as you correctly pointed out and you preempted my question, yes, there is a code for social security and that the Indian government, like you said, is trying to recognize this. Up until it is put into effect, it is notified, Is there some kind of framework that Uber is looking at to assist the drivers here in terms of social security?
Yeah. I want to be able to choose how to work. I want to be able to choose when I can work. I really value this flexibility, but I should also be entitled to certain social protections. If I get sick, I ought to be able to have some kind of protection, some kind of insurance. If I have an accident, I should be entitled to some type of protection, some type of insurance. If I choose maternal leave, or if I have some kind of situation in my life and I can't work, there should be some kind of protection. We agree with that. We believe that is the future, that is the way that as people increasingly choose to work in a flexible way, that they ought to be able to get those types of benefits that historically only employees were entitled to. The question is, how do you do that in a legal framework that's not set up for that? You know, we need to think about certain objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? Let's create a framework that is focused on principles, that's focused on objectives, that doesn't try to be too prescriptive, but allows innovation to continue to change, and allows companies to continue to grow, and as long as they are meeting these principles, as long as they are meeting these objectives. That's what the Code of Social Security does.
The conversations that we have with a lot of these drivers and some of their platforms and unions that speak to us say that there are concerns in terms of high commissions being charged, we're not being paid as much as what we used to earlier. These are some of the concerns that emerge. But at the same time, you continue to say that Uber provides employment benefits which are third after the Indian Army and the Indian Railway service. Can you give us a sense of this picture as to remuneration for drivers? Is that a subject of discussion?
It's always a subject of discussion. I mean, you know, the reality is Uber's unlocked about 445 billion Indian rupees in economic value into this country by the operation of the platform. We can continue to create that type of economic value for anyone who comes to the platform for an opportunity to work. How we continue to do that is making sure that, again, that we're allowed to innovate the technology in ways that make rides more efficient, that makes matching more efficient, that takes into concern some of the pain points that drivers have identified for us, that riders have identified for us. So all of that goes into the way we think about the operation of the platform and how we can continue to improve it.
Well, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Newscentre. News and updates continue right here on CNBC-TV18. Stay tuned.